Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about voting. So far we've been talking about the political parties and what their goals are, mostly to win elections, and how they, use propaganda to do that, and how they have the functions of educate, nominate, recruit, watch, and win. We've talked a little bit about the differences between Democrats and Republicans, and they're all trying to get your vote. But today we need to talk about the history of voting rights and how you actually go about voting. So let's get started. First of all, you might be surprised to know that the U.S. Constitution did not originally define who was eligible to vote. Voting qualifications were left up to the states. So let's go ahead and write that in your notes, that the Constitution didn't define who was eligible, that it was left up to the states. And in 1789, when George Washington was elected president, only 6% of the U.S. population was eligible to vote. That means 94% of Americans did not have the right to vote. So when we're talking about voting today, it's really important that you guys get how much people have fought for this right to vote and how valuable your right to vote is, and why it's really important that you use that right. Because if you don't use your rights, there's a really good chance that you'll lose those rights. So in 1789, 94% of the population of America could not vote. They were denied that right. The first people who were allowed to vote were white male property owners and white males who had taxable incomes. So please write in property owners and taxable incomes. And one of the justifications of that was that people thought they didn't want people to vote who didn't care about the country. And they thought that if you owned property, or if you made enough money to pay a lot of taxes, that then you would care enough to actually find out about the candidates, educate yourself about the issues, and make an educated vote. And so another reason that it is really important to prove that everybody takes that responsibility seriously. But that was why they thought it, that if you didn't own property and you weren't paying a lot of taxes, you wouldn't care enough. Finally, in 1790, in 1790, free white immigrants became eligible to vote. There was actually a law passed in 1790 that said if you were white, then you could go through the naturalization process to become a citizen. That excluded Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, anybody that wasn't white. In 1856, so almost 100 years after the country, started, that the vote expanded to all white men. So still in 1856, only white men could vote. So let's talk a little bit about Native Americans. That Native Americans weren't allowed to vote until 1924. One, they weren't really allowed to own property. The reservations were not considered property of the United States. They were considered property of the tribes. So that didn't count as them owning property. And oftentimes, if they did get property outside of the U.S. government, it was easily taken away. And as you know, the land that they owned was taken away by the U.S. government with all the wars that were fought with the Indians in the early days of our country. Also, Native Americans were not considered U.S. citizens. They were considered citizens of the tribes that they belonged to, not of the country of the United States. So they did not pass the qualifications of what it meant to be a U.S. citizen. So when we're thinking about that, we think about the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship by all persons born or naturalized in the United States, right? So write in 14th Amendment in your notes. So it's back to Native American 14th Amendment. But even though they were born in the United States, they were not considered citizens. Like I said, they were considered citizens of their reservations, and some of them were told that they could vote if they gave up their tribal affiliations, but it wouldn't be guaranteed. In the early days of voting rights, in the early days of our country, people would get the right to vote and then it would be taken away again. Oftentimes, the government needed, or different political parties might need the vote of certain groups, and so they might allow them to vote for certain elections if it helped them, but it would be taken away again. And a lot of times Native Americans didn't want to give up their tribal affiliations. First of all, it was a big part of their identity often, and they were proud of being part of their tribe. But also, if they weren't guaranteed the right to vote, or they weren't guaranteed the privileges of citizenship, then oftentimes they didn't want to give up that other affiliation. And I wanted to, before we get to some of the things about African Americans, I also want to talk about Asian Americans, that Asian Americans were not given the right to vote, and they were not allowed to become naturalized citizen. And in fact, in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act that specifically barred people of Chinese ancestry from being naturalized or becoming U.S. citizens. As late as 1922, Japanese citizens were denied the right to become citizens. Japanese Americans or people of Japanese descent were not allowed to become citizens because of all the fears during after World War I and leading into World War II. Finally, in 1952, then there was the McLaren-Walter Act that barred people from, that finally allowed all Asian Americans the right to vote. But that wasn't until 1952 that Asian Americans were allowed to vote. Okay, so getting back to our notes, though, if we look at now we're at the part that says African Americans. And African Americans did become citizens with the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So please write in 14th Amendment. That's our one that defines citizenship. And could vote with the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, right? That's what those amendments say. But you guys know from what you learned in 7th grade and just from other things you've learned about American history that even though those things were passed in the 1800s after the Civil War, that there was still a huge struggle for African Americans to get the rights of citizenship and the rights that they deserve and the right to vote. Because remember that in order for an African American to vote, in many states, they still had to pass a literacy test, write-in test. They had to pay a poll tax. They had to find the polling locations, which were often hidden from them. And they also dealt with many threats of physical violence. And the literacy tests, as you guys have learned before, were sometimes really, really unfair. They were given very complicated readings that would be difficult for anyone to read, let alone somebody who had been denied access to education, as many African Americans were. Sometimes the poll tax was really a lot of money, and again, these are, at that time that people were not allowed to have the same kind of jobs that white Americans were allowed to have, so they didn't have enough money sometimes. And then, they were crazy things to keep them away from voting, like hiding the polling places. And as you guys know, we've talked about the KKK and threats of violence, and even, intimidation and stuff like that was used, as you know. So when did African Americans get the right to vote? In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and that was the final thing that forbid any states from having any of those crazy things preventing African Americans the right to vote. So in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and they were finally given the right to vote. All right, so if we look at the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is what gave women the right to vote. So now we're looking at the section that says women. So in order to get the right to vote, women like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul protested and were arrested for trying to vote. So just for trying to vote, they were arrested, but they so wanted to have an equal say in the government and so wanted to be able to participate in democracy that they were, dedicated their lives to this. And in fact, Alice Paul almost died in prison during a hunger strike trying to gain support for getting women the right to vote. She was arrested trying to vote. She was being held in prison. And in order to make sure that she wasn't forgotten about or people were still paying attention to what was happening, she organized a hunger strike and refused to eat until women were given the right to vote. And in fact, that was the event that led to the eventual pass of the 19th Amendment. So finally, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, which is 50 years after African Americans were granted the right to vote, or at least that the 15th Amendment was passed. And the 19th Amendment gave every woman the right to vote. But the point of all this, you guys, is just that people fought so hard to get the right to vote, and it hasn't been something that was always given to people. And so we shouldn't take it for granted. When you turn 18 and you have the right to vote, you need to educate yourself about the candidates and about the issues and use this right. People have gone to extreme measures. Some more examples about the women is that in 1782, Susan B. Anthony was arrested in New York for attempting to vote. Just for voting, she was arrested. She was taken to prison and held there just for trying to vote. In that same year, 1782, Sojourner Truth tries to vote in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she was turned away. She wasn't arrested, but she was another person who dedicated her whole life to advocate for justice and equality. She was a former slave who just gave everything trying to get equal rights for people. So now that we have equal rights, you have to use them. Don't let these people's efforts to have been in vain. Use these rights. Another group, you guys may not know about this, but if you lived in Washington, D.C., you were not allowed to vote until 1961. The Founding Fathers kind of thought that those people would be too close to Congress, maybe too influential in government, and so they decided that they shouldn't be able to vote because they might be too, have too much influence. But finally, they were given the right in 1961. The 23rd Amendment gave residents of D.C. the right to vote for president. But you guys might still see that D.C. residents, a lot of them have license plates that say, taxation without representation. And part of that is because they still don't have any representation in Congress, that they are not represented in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. So that means that they don't have a lot of say in the laws that are passed in this nation, even today. And young Americans. So before, the age requirement for voting was 21, and the argument, but people didn't like that it was 21 because people said that if we could be drafted into the military, then at 18, then we should be allowed to vote. So let's see what it says in the notes here. Before, the age requirement for voting was 21, so write that in your notes. And the argument was, if a soldier could die for their country at 18, they should be able to vote for it. So if you could be drafted and have to go fight for your country, you definitely need to have a say in those elected officials that are making the decision whether or not to go to war. The president who's deciding whether or not to send in troops, Congress who declares war. You should be able to vote and have a say in that if you can be sent overseas or sent someplace to fight and die. Finally, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Prisoners, that's another group that voting rights can be an issue. States determine if prisoners can vote. In Virginia, Virginia has a lifelong ban on voting for residents with a felony. So if you are convicted of a felony, then you lose your right to vote in Virginia for life. You can appeal to the governor to reinstate your voting rights, but it's not guaranteed, and it's pretty rare. But if you felt strongly about, if you were convicted of a felony and wanted your voting rights back, you could appeal to the governor and try and get your rights back. So, why should you vote? It is your most basic responsibility. Our country is founded on democracy, and that is government of the people and by the people. So if the people do not speak, then our democracy is really meaningless. And it's only taken 200 years to get the right to vote. So I think, all those people who have sacrificed and fought for the right to vote knew how important it was. And I think if you thought your right to vote to be taken away, your right to vote would be taken away, you would want, not be happy about that. So got to use that right. So let's talk a little bit about how you do it. So how do you vote? Voter registration is required before a citizen may vote. You got to go and register. Okay, so, yeah, okay. Voter registration is required before a citizen can vote, and the number of citizens that register and vote is related to how important election issues are to citizens. That, if there's an issue that's really, really important on people's minds, then they're more likely to go out to vote than if they just don't feel like the issues matter to them at all. Only citizens that register can participate in primary and general elections. You can't just show up on voting day and expect that you're going to be able to vote. You do have to register in advance. And in Virginia, it's 22 days in advance. You have to go and register to vote. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, qualifications to register and vote in Virginia. First, you've got to be a citizen of the United States. Okay, so you have to have either been born here or gone through the naturalization process and be a citizen in order to vote. You must be a resident of Virginia and a precinct of your voting area. So in order to vote in Virginia, you have to be living in Virginia. That's what it means by Virginia. And you have to be living in the area that you're voting in. So precincts are kind of small. I think I go to my daughter's elementary school to vote. That's where my precinct votes. But I think almost precincts are as small as the area that the elementary schools go into. I think elementary schools are pretty common voting areas. Your precincts might be different from street to street. So just like, when you're growing up, you might live on one street and go to one elementary school, and the next street over, they might go to another elementary school. It's kind of the same with precincts. They're pretty small. When you register to vote, they tell you where your polling place will be, and that's your precinct or your voting area. And then the other qualification is that you have to be 18 years old by the day of the general election. Now, we just said you have to register 22 days in advance to be able to vote. So if your birthday is on the election day, then you can vote. And you can, when you go to register, they'll say, oh, okay, the elections are November 4th, your birthday is November 4th, so we'll go ahead and register you. And this year, the election day is November 4th, but if your birthday is November 5th, then you have to wait to the next election. There's no exceptions to that. You've got to be 18 by that election day. So how do you go to register? That's the first step in being able to vote. You've got to go and register 22 days in advance. And you can do that one in person at the registrar's office. And that's not a typo. It's called the registrar's office. And that's like a government building where you go for all kinds of licenses. You can go to register to vote. You go there to get your marriage license when you get married. You can go there if you are registering a business, if you're trying to get a patent, all kind of like you're registering different things. And they are all over. There's one that's it's right by Fair Oaks Mall. There's a government registrar's office over there. That's where I had to go to get a copy of my marriage license recently. And so you can register to vote there. The second thing is at the DMV, or the Department of Motor Vehicles. I think it's Department of Motor Vehicles, even if there's division there. And that's probably the most common way that people register to vote, because when you get your driver's license, when you are 16, usually people just go ahead and register to vote at that time. So that's the second place. You can also do it in the mail. You can print out an application and mail it in, so by mail application. and at other designated sites or places. So sometimes, especially leading up to an election, you might see somebody set up at the library with a booth to register to vote. Or if you go to fall festivals, there might be a candidate there who's handing out pamphlets, and they also have forms to register to vote. Sometimes it's schools. Sometimes they'll go to the high school because a lot of you guys are going to turn 18 while you're still in high school. So sometimes they'll set up an area at a high school on certain days where you can go ahead and register to vote. And as long as they have permission to be doing that, then that's fine. You can do that. And another that has recently been added is online. This has actually changed in just the last 2 years, I think, that you can go online and register to vote in Virginia. And that has changed. So if you see that on a test, especially one that was made a while ago, please ask us about it because that has changed. Okay, and remember, registration is closed 22 days before elections. Another thing that is new this year is that you do have to bring identification. You used to not have to bring a form of identification. You had to just kind of be able to say what your address was. But new this year, you do have to bring a government-issued ID, which can be a driver's license. There is such a thing as it's just an identification card. So you can bring that. You can bring a passport, but you have to bring some kind of government-issued ID to vote. Factors predicting which citizens will vote. So we've talked a lot today about all the ways that people have fought to get the right to vote, but as we know, and we'll look at some more statistics about this, not everybody does exercise that right to vote. So how can we predict who is going to actually vote? One is education. That is a big predicting factor on who will actually take that privilege seriously. Is the more educated you are, the more you're likely to vote. So the more education you have, the more you are likely to vote. So if you graduate high school, you're more likely to vote than somebody who doesn't. If you graduate college, you're more likely to vote than somebody who doesn't. If you have a master's degree or a PhD, you're more likely to vote than people who don't. So more education equals more likely to vote. Also age. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote. And some of you guys saw a little video that we watched where it said, as we get older, I think people recognize how important it is to vote and how much the government really is involved in our lives and how we should have a say in it. So right now, older people are more likely to vote, and so issues that are important to older people are more likely to be taken seriously because politicians know that the younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. So they don't really need to pay attention to those issues in order to get reelected, or that's the way some of them think. And also income. That is a big predicting factor. The more money you make, the more likely you are to vote. And I do want to say, of course, this is not, doesn't apply to everybody. There are a lot of people who maybe didn't graduate high school who are very active in politics and are really, advocate voting and vote all the time. And even though the more income you make, the more likely you are to vote, there are a lot of people who don't make a lot of money who also take their rights seriously. So this is just ways we can predict, but it doesn't mean, that nobody who doesn't make any money votes. So it's just to predict. So why do citizens fail to vote or why not to vote? We just learned how hard people fought to get the right to vote and how important it is to have your voice heard in government. So why wouldn't you just go ahead and vote? The number one reason is just lack of interest. Another word for that is apathy. You just feel like my vote won't make a difference. And so they just don't bother to go to the polling place and wait in line and vote. Or they don't think that the issues affect them, which is really, really a misconception that there's so many things that our local government does that affect us, our state government does that affect us. So it's important to educate yourself and know that this is not true. But it is the number one reason. If you ask people why they don't vote, they just don't think that it will make a difference or that the issues don't matter to them. Apathy. The second reason is the failure to register or not registered. So sometimes people will forget to register. or they'll realize that they're not registered. Now, one thing is, once you're registered to vote, you never have to register again unless you move. So even if you just move down the street and you have a different address, you do need to re-register to vote. But once you've registered one time, you don't have to register again. But that's the second reason that people do not vote. Okay, and another thing that's important to know is that the percentage of voters that participate in presidential elections is usually greater than the percentage of voters that participate in state and local elections. So every 4 years we elect a president, and the percentage of voters that participate in presidential elections is usually greater. So every 4 years you'll see that there are more voters that go out to vote than the congressional and Senate races and local elections that will happen in between. There's pretty much an election every single year in November. But again, every 4 years when a president is elected, people are more likely to go out and vote than in state and local elections. And instead of putting Barack Obama here, I guess I should have put Governor McAuliffe for one of our local people. Okay, so that's it. I'm not sure what the time is right now, but you'll probably have a quick check to do either right now or when we come back to class on the next class day. But thank you so much for paying attention, and please raise your hand if you have any questions about all the stuff we just talked about.